Okay, so welcome to the Whalers Cabin at Point Lobos, an historical landmark and something that's very special here in the reserve. This building was built in 1851, and it was built by the first people to come in and settle here permanently, and they were the Chinese that sailed into this beautiful little cove on their junkets and settled here, and their livelihood was fishing. So this cabin was actually built by the Chinese. And they stayed for some time, and there was also a very, very culturally rich and vibrant Chinese community in Monterey. Unfortunately, that village, the Chinese villages, it was called burned down many, many years ago. And that community's become somewhat dispersed. But in any case, it kind of started here. And the cabin right now, you can see a plank floor. At that time, it was a dirt floor. Many years later, the wood floor was put in, and it's kind of interesting because if you want to turn your camera to this little plexiglass cutout that we have, it's full of little trinkets, pieces of china, and so forth. But right here, you can see that the floor actually rests on whalebone. And whalebone, unlike wood, is impervious to termites. So that is one of the reasons this building is still standing. Very, very termite, what do we call, averse. So anyway, we have the Chinese that came. And then this cove, as I said, has an incredibly rich history. Soon thereafter, because we are on the migratory path for gray whales that come up and down the Pacific coast, coming from Alaska, traveling south to Baja California to have their babies, and then going back north. We're on that migratory path. The migration begins around January and goes for the gray whales through about March. And so the Portuguese were great whalers. The Japanese were also whalers, but the Portuguese came in from the Azores, and this was a very important whaling station, and there were many. Fortunately, the whales, the populations and species were just raped at that point in history. But this was a big whaling station. And on the off time, when the migration ended, the Portuguese were also very talented farmers, and in particular, and this display exemplifies it, that is here, they farmed, and they had a very successful beef and dairy farming operation. And the meadow that is outside this cabin, just to the side, was at one point in time full of dairy cow beef. So actually, we have a couple of cheese presses here. And if you've ever gone into a Safeway or any other store and bought Monterey Jack cheese, this is where it comes from. It really does come from Monterey. It's an Azurean recipe, traditional recipe for cheese. So I'm going to refer to a little brochure because it has such a great little chrono and timeline. We've got, as I said, the Chinese coming in 1851, and in 1861, actually, the Portuguese are noted as having come in and started the whaling industry. But then beyond that, in the late 1800s, one of the amazing things about this area is that, given with early exploration, the fur trade had almost wiped out the sea otter population. The sea otters were near extinction. Sea otters feed on abalone, and they feed on sea urchins. And in turn, in that habitat, sea urchins and abalone also feed on kelp. So when you have no otters, you have a profusion of abalone, and when you have that kind of explosion in population of abalone, your kelp forests disappear. What you see today in Monterey Bay is a much better balance of that entire ecosystem. We now have again our sea otters. A small colony was discovered of about a raft of about 30 otters or so, just south of Point Lobos. And in the early 1900s, they were reintroduced into Monterey Bay, into protected areas, protected waters. So we have now a population on the Pacific coast of around 2,200, I believe it is, and that population's kind of leveled off. It's not declining, but it's not growing. There's some reasons for that. But because we have our sea otters back, our whole ecosystem is kind of back in balance. We don't have the profusion of abalone, and as I kind of began my story, the Japanese, when they came in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they did have, it was just like the gold rush for abalone. They were taking thousands and thousands of abalone out of here every day for 30 years almost. So there's a fabulous picture behind you and display that shows you the type of vessels that the Japanese did use to dive from. In this direction, there is a diving suit that was used here at Point Lobos in Whalers Cove and about. The Japanese were very skilled divers. In Japan, abalone was a delicacy. It was considered junk food. It was not part of the American diet. So they capitalized on that. They saw this profusion of abalone, very large abalone, fully mature. It takes about 15 years for an abalone to get that large. And they pried them off the rocks here for 30 years. They set them out on drying racks. This picture is a very good example of just the dozens and dozens of drying racks that were spread out all around this cove. And where we have today the parking lot, you can see in this picture a building which was a canning factory, Point Lobos cannery. They canned abalone and they shipped it back to Japan. We do have some examples of the cans and the labels right there. But they partnered at that time with the man who owned a lot of the land here, J. Allen. And he's a very well-known historical figure, and he's to be credited for having this property intact in one chunk. And so we're very grateful to him. They had a business relationship, and that was the abalone canning factory. In addition to that, where the parking lot is now, where you probably just parked, if you look carefully at the landscape, there's actually a scar in the landscape there. We have a rock here, a form of granodiorite, and it was mined. It was a quarry, and some of that granite is spread about the Bay Area, and helped to serve as the foundation for several very well-known buildings. And historically, I'm trying to think now what else.
Well, I forgot about some of the people that lived here were Army sergeants during World War II, where they were training for amphibious landings and things like that right out here. The tree was planted either in 1870 or 1890, thereabouts. We're not exactly sure which, but I've heard both. Some people say 1870, some people say around 1890. And it's a Monterey cypress, planted in the wrong place, obviously. It's decided to come in. It's probably, what, maybe 140 years old. These things can live 450 years, so it's probably got another 250, 300 years to go. So who knows where it's going to go, but I'm not going to worry too much about it myself.